So when we intentionally develop a strong relationship, how does that look? For instance, when you meet someone you like, how do you get from initially meeting them and coming to like them to determining they could be a life partner? This is not the main idea of this video, by the way. This is a lead-in. You'd start by spending time together, not just time together, because you could say that the friends you go bowling with every week, after enough weeks, are people that you spend a lot of time with. And that counts for something, but it's not necessarily the most quality time, when the point is to develop a deep trust with someone that's going to result in you choosing to give them your heart. So when we say spend a lot of time together, when the purpose is to develop a deep trust that will help you to responsibly determine whether this is a person you could see yourself sharing the rest of your life with, a person that you could see yourself choosing, there'd be a lot of intentionality behind that. Even if you enjoyed the process, it would still be an intentional process, because it's not a thing you're willing to leave to chance. It's a close bond that you'd be relying on, in a real way, depending on. And you'd want to know for sure, is this just a cute person who's actually crazy? Or is this a person I have enough in common with that we would actually be comfortable spending time with the same friends? Is this a person I can trust not to go blabbing things I told them in confidence? There's a lot of things that you come to know about a person by getting to know them, being in their life, being there in person, spending time with one another's friends, being together across different kinds of social situations. And over the course of time, by that social process, we come to know each other. So I just described, in very simple terms, a process by which we make somebody who is a stranger into somebody who is an intimate companion. That was my preamble. In this video, I aim to draw a very specific line within the broad topic of boundaries. And if you're finding that some of the damage you took on in your experience with church culture had to do with boundaries that were crossed, or boundaries that were never established that you never knew you needed until after the damage was done, I think you'll find this installment to be clarifying, and I certainly hope you will. My lead-in to this episode was about the process of establishing the trust that is needed when intentionally forming an intimate bond, an intimate relationship. So let's contrast that with the process of getting connected in a church community. First and most obvious, the church leader, some actually call father, and they call him that from the very first time they ever meet him. Some call their church leader pastor, some call their church leader reverend, and they say those things as if it's their name. And I wonder which one of those has been true in your experience. And I wonder what connotation you attached to whatever title that was normal for you to use. But for a specific example, just consider for a moment what an intimate thing it is to call somebody father, especially if you don't really know them. And you don't know them personally, but you are in a place that, at least on the surface of things, looks like the kind of place you should be able to gamble on being trustworthy. Exhibit B, my church family. Maybe you've said that. I'm sure you at least know people who have said that. They talk about their community as their church family. That's another really intimate term to use. It just is. Calling someone father, calling a group of people family, that suggests that you are close enough that you can count on depending on one another. Even if you've never so much as borrowed a cup of sugar, or taken each other to the airport, even if you've only ever shared small talk after Sunday morning services, and even if you've only assumed what each other is like. How many people have been completely blindsided when finding out that their priest was a convicted child molester? How many people have been blindsided by finding out their pastor had a long-term ongoing affair behind his wife's back? And those are just examples that have come up enough times that they're commonly heard of. So when I'm talking about boundaries in the church sphere of influence, the first and primary thing that I'm trying to point out is this legitimately strange phenomenon of letting someone in to a deep place in your heart without knowing them. So this is something worth taking a good, clear look at, because this points at two things. First, it points at the need that many of us feel to have somebody to count on in the spiritual dimension of our lives. And then secondly, it points to a willingness to enter a vulnerable place that's perhaps more vulnerable than we consciously recognize when entering it. So when you play back in your mind whatever the fallout looked like for you, maybe it was a church split, maybe it was you individually walking away from your church, maybe it was you being thrown out of your church. Consider whether the end of your relationship with those people in that particular church was peaceable in the way you parted ways. Was there a mutual understanding in which you chose different directions and that was okay, by which I mean you wish each other well? Or was it a situation where you were told, here's how it's going to be, and you had a very limited voice in the matter? I realized I needed to talk about this topic when an old familiar instinct kicked in that made me start censoring myself when a misunderstanding took place between me and a good friend. And it wasn't anything new. It was the kind of thing that has happened many times in my life. And it wasn't a huge thing. But this time that it happened, I realized precisely what was happening. I realized that my friend had said something that hurt me, and I didn't know how to respond. And it came by way of a message. It didn't come in real time in conversation, which leaves room for even deeper misunderstanding. I'm sure you know people who get along just fine when they're together, and then the craziest misunderstandings happen by text. But when it happened this time, I realized something. I realized I'm not speaking up for myself. I'm not... Two things. I'm not making it known how I feel. from what was said, how I was affected by it, and I'm not communicating how I need for them to treat me if we are going to be close. And once I concluded that, I had to consider, how did this go so wrong that I never learned that to begin with? And here's what I concluded. I concluded that in my upbringing, in my experience in the church, which, as I've said in an earlier episode, was quite a big part of my upbringing. It was quite a big part of my small town life. It was assumed that we were going to be on the same page, that there wasn't going to be pushback from the way things were done. And just like it became so commonplace to hear about a priest being a child molester, a megachurch pastor cheating on his wife, it became so normal to hear of church splits happening in fundamentalist circles. It feels like a trope and a joke until you're in the middle of it. And it speaks to a cultural norm of not having a voice, not having a voice of your own, of all singing the same song in harmony because it's the song that the pastor is leading. First, second, and fourth verse, of course. I'd also like to say this video is intended primarily for the sake of helping those who feel wounded to find language to articulate what has happened and to enter a reconstruction process. I don't mean for that to sound like deconstruction, because by reconstruction, I mean literally taking back their own life. I don't mean necessarily rebuilding a faith system. I mean putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's certainly a nice idea to think that there may be church communities that don't operate like what I'm describing today. But I think I'm quite sure I'm not alone in this sentiment and in this system of how I was affected. So for those of you who can relate, that idea of not having a voice of your own likely meant two things, or two phases of kind of the same thing. One, that you likely entered what you hoped was a safe place, and you made yourself vulnerable to being led in that place. And then the second phase being that you went along with what you were told, and you went along with what was asked of you, even when you weren't sure that it was exactly right, and even when it was too much to ask of you. So without going on at length about that particular point, let me simply say, I think there have been many, many people who have gotten burnt out as a result of staying in a place and in a position or in a capacity in which they were not afforded the luxury, basic human right, of having their own voice. But another thing that is a cultural norm in some churches is this idea that the pastor is the man of God. The idea that this almost papal authority rests on the shoulders of the church leader, and that it's not to be questioned. I'm glad that I can say I've spent time, a lot of time, in churches that were pretty different from one another. And because of that, I've been able to see the contrast of how it can be when there's more internal accountability among the leadership. Instead of there just being one person who tells everybody what to do and there's the door. If you don't like it, you don't have to stay. But going back to the instance that brought this to clarity for me, I realized I wasn't speaking up when I felt hurt by something, and there was more to it. I realized that I was afraid to say what had bothered me, because it was one thing to feel hurt and to know that maybe my friend didn't mean anything by what was said. But it felt like a bigger risk to be hurt and then say something and then not be taken seriously. Or worse, to feel hurt and then speak up about it and then find out that they didn't care. And it occurred to me that's a strange insecurity, at least if you lay it out rationally. It's strange to feel close to somebody and to not want to jeopardize that closeness by telling them what your needs are. Like how you need them to treat you in order for you to feel respected. Because if we play that out over the course of time, there are invisible things like, subtext within that never get spoken, but they're there anyways. It's that idea of knowing someone over the course of time means knowing each other long enough and well enough for more to come out of them. As each of our personal evolution goes on, we sort of unpack more of who we are. We learn new things, we try new things. Life as a journey takes whatever direction it takes, and that can look very different over the course of time. So to have somebody that you would call a close friend, you'd think that having the title of close friend would mean that you felt safe, at a minimum, to tell each other how you are affected by each other, how you are affected by what each other says and does. So what does it mean if we can't bring ourselves to do that in the relationships that we have identified as trusting relationships? Bengal Spice. If you're a tea drinker and you haven't tried Bengal Spice, do yourself a favor. I submit to you that it means we're afraid of losing what little we have. And I choose those words specifically and intentionally. We have learned to be afraid that we are not worth caring for. That we are worth using. But that we must not really matter, because if we mattered, then the people who cared for us would have cared for us better. And as it was, we were useful for as long as we could fill a position or serve the machine, but that when it came right down to it, our perspective didn't matter. Because if it mattered, it would have been taken into account. And it seems to me that once that becomes normal, it becomes a boundary that you didn't realize needed protecting. And then it just becomes a porous boundary from then on, or a rigid boundary. Because if you've been really hurt by that, maybe you don't become a pushover. Maybe you become someone with a barrier up so that nobody takes advantage of you in any way ever again. And both of those things get in the way of having healthy, legitimately trusting relationships. But how do we come back from that? There are ways, and there's plenty of great material out there on the subject of boundaries. I could recommend some of it, but for the time being, I'm just going to finish what I came to say for now. Let me finish by describing what the purpose is of communicating a boundary to someone you love, to someone who you believe loves you, and to someone you do trust and or want to trust. First, remember that boundaries are not just about keeping people out. They're also about determining who to let in. But then, when you communicate where the line is, here's what that can mean. And you may even want to communicate it in this way and say outright what it means. Because what it means is this. When you do this thing that you just did, you affect me this way. If I don't communicate to you the way that you're affecting me, then I will get used to putting up walls and building resentment in our relationship from a perception of you not knowing and maybe not caring about how you're affecting me. But I am communicating this to you because I believe that you do care about me, and because I believe that if you know that you're hurting me, you will have a genuine desire not to hurt me. And depending on the response to that, you can always tack on to the end whether or not you understand how I could be affected this way. This is how it is. And if you don't respect this boundary, I respect myself enough to put distance between myself and those who won't show me the respect that I have communicated as a basic need. To summarize it even further, communicating a boundary to someone you care about is the same as saying, I am pursuing connection between us. I don't want our connection to be disrupted. I hope this has been helpful for you. I imagine it's been some food for thought. I would love to hear how it strikes you, and if you have any personal stories that you'd like to share, please feel free.